All right, welcome everybody. This is Patrick Field. Thank you for joining this webinar. I think what's about just shortly before 5 after, so we will get started. As you know, this webinar is sponsored by NYSERDA for one of the 2 offshore wind developers recently awarded the procurement by the state of New York. It's intended primarily for fishermen. The hour or so of our webinar will include a presentation by Greg Lampman from NYSERDA, and an introduction by Martin Goff of Equinor about the project, and some time for questions as well regarding the project. Please do note this is relatively early in project development, so there are a number of much more site-specific questions that are certainly or maybe on your mind, but probably won't be able to be answerable today. To let you know, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available for the folks who couldn't attend on the Fisheries Technical Working Group website, so people can look at it at their convenience if they wish to after today. So the mechanics are this. We have everybody but our 2 speakers on mute to manage background sound and noise. There's a chat function on the Zoom webinar, and so all you have to do is go to chat, and you can actually pose a question, and that question will go to Maggie, our host here at CBI. And what she'll do as those questions or comments come in is she will collect those and forward those to Greg. Once Martin is done with his presentation, Greg will go through the questions and actually pose those to Martin for some back and forth and Q&A time there. And then we'll close shortly before 4 o'clock. So that is our plan for the day. Thank you again for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Greg Lampman.
That NYSERDA has been doing in the offshore space recently that might be of use to the folks on the webinar, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the NYSERDA procurement, and followed up with handing it over to Empire Wind so that so they can talk to their project specifically. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. So one of the things that we're pretty excited about is last month we launched 2 mid-ocean buoys into the New York Bight. They're identified within the draft wind energy areas here on the map, so BOEM's draft wind energy areas. They're deployed for a period of 2 years, and they're going to be collecting continuous mid-ocean data, which is wind speed at hub heights and through the rotor swept zone, as well as oceanographic information. But in addition to traditional mid-ocean data, which will be collected at the international standards, we're also going to be collecting information about wildlife. So these buoys are additionally equipped with acoustic monitoring devices to listen for birds, to listen for bat calls, and passive acoustic monitoring for marine mammals. And we've additionally outfitted them with nanotag antennas for tagged fish and tagged birds. So we're going to be collecting a lot of information about wildlife with these, as well as traditional mid-ocean data. All of that information is going to be made publicly available in near real time on the DNV-GL website, as well as the Normando website. And we'll be posting a link on the NYSERDA offshore wind page probably next week, where you'll be able to access that data easily, but you can Google it now. Next slide, please. Some additional work that we've talked about a bit in the past that might be interesting is a digital aerial survey that we started conducting a little over 3 years ago. The last digital survey, the last flight of that survey was executed this past spring, and the images are now being identified, and that data is being made available as the images are QA/QC'd. But basically, the aircraft fly over the New York Bight, so 16,700 square mile area that we outlined for the project, and collects images. And we've collected more than 3.5 million images in this quarterly survey, 3-year survey that was being conducted seasonally 4 times a year. And in addition to traditional macrofauna that you see in the slide here, we've also been collecting, where possible, images of fish shoals. So understanding fish shoal distributions and looking at correlations between, we're going to be looking at correlations between fish shoals and some of the more macrovertebrates. Get the next slide, please. We're also excited about a couple of new projects that we are in the midst of contracting that relate to commercial fishing specifically. The first one is looking at what constrains fishing access within a turbine array and mitigations that can be undertaken to improve that access. That project is being led by the Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, with support of RODA, the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance, as well as a number of other folks. And again, this is really trying to understand what can we do to maximize fishing access within turbine arrays. So it's kind of spatially agnostic in terms of individual sites, but will be beneficial for offshore wind and commercial fishing generally. The other project is trying to develop a fisherman's data trust. So through our master planning process, we've heard a lot about information that fishermen have that would be of value to the development process. That information is not necessarily readily available, and a lot of it is proprietary to the fishermen themselves. And so we're going to be working with Rhoda to try to set up a fisherman's data trust that is basically a database that allows fishermen to provide data but protect the confidentiality around that data, and for the data trust to be able to put out that information in a format that is not problematic to the fishermen, but useful for decision makers at the state and federal level. So again, this is trying to bring information that fishermen have to bear in the state and federal decision making about offshore wind energy development. Both of these contracts are, again, in development at this time, and we'll have more information about them once we finalize that and begin the actual projects. Get the next slide, please. One of the primary ways we've been communicating with the fishing industry so far has been through our Fishing Technical Working Group. The Fishing Technical Working Group is really a forum for discussions between the fishing industry and the offshore wind developers with support of the state and federal agencies. So you see across the top, the key stakeholders are really, these are the key representatives of the fishing industry. And on the right side is they're counterweighted with the developers who hold leases in the space. And really it's an opportunity for them to discuss issues of common interest. But again, on the lower half, you'll see these two groups are supported by regional state agencies. That includes not just representatives in New York State, but also regional representation from states across the area, as well as the federal agencies with jurisdiction in the space. And so this group really has conversations that the regulators can learn from and think about, and also help build understanding and facilitate communications between the other two groups. They work at both a spatially agnostic way. So for example, they helped us identify the project that I talked about a few moments ago, but also on a site-specific way in dealing with individual projects. So again, this is our primary form of communication with the fishing industry, but we're also now in the process of hiring a fishing liaison who will be able to give us more direct access and one-on-one conversations with representatives of the fishing industry. So we're trying to take it with industry representatives through the F-TWG, and then using our fisheries liaison, who will be coming on board later this year, to have more one-on-one conversations with fishermen generally. Get the next slide, please. And just to reiterate a little bit, so we've, one of the things that the F-TWG has been working on, and we're getting started now, is development of best management practices or best management principles. This is not to be redundant with the work that the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance and Rhoda have been working on, but really thinking about what best management practices or principles could be incorporated in a state procurement. So what things could we require contractually of developers who are successfully bidding to New York State? So we'll be working with the fishing industry on development of those to advance to the Public Service Commission. Again, they helped us work to identify topical areas that were included in the solicitation that resulted in this fishing access study and the data trust. And last year, we instigated a process of trying to understand how fishermen use the New York Bight, hoping to inform the federal process on development of transit lanes. And that culminated in a workshop last year, and we're picking that up again and trying to provide some greater granularity and understanding around transit in the area. Again, hoping to inform the BOEM process so they can use that in their decision-making around development of new leases in the New York Bight. And again, this is, we're hiring a fisheries liaison, but all of the work of the F-TWG is available on that website at the bottom of the page. You can go there, you can get summaries of the meetings we've had and some of the work streams that we're engaged in currently. Next slide, please. In addition to this, what I think of as, well, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So shifting gears a little bit, you may have heard earlier this year, the legislature and the governor came together to sign into law the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Embedded within this act is the requirement to the state to procure 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. We're continuing to commit to do that on both a cost-effective, do this in a cost-effective and responsible way, but it's a pretty substantial goal in achieving the overall goal of 100% clean energy by 2040. So again, this 9,000 megawatt mandate is akin to about 30% of the state electricity load. So it's a pretty major part of the renewable energy mandates for New York State. So one of the things we're working toward. Next slide. And a major step in achieving this goal was the solicitation that we released late in 2018 and that we're currently in contract negotiations around. That solicitation was for offshore wind projects. Through that solicitation, we received 18 different bids from 4 different proposers. This is a record number of responses, and the individual bids were put forth, included different project sizes and different economic development opportunities. But overall, those proposals were evaluated based on these 3 criteria. So 70% of the selection was weighted on price, so the overall offtake price for the electricity and the ORECs. 20% of it was rated on economic development benefits for New York State, and 10% was comprised of project viability. This included things like the relative advanced stage of the projects, the permitting stage of the project, and also the degree to which they would be working with the fishing community and others to advance the project in a way that was responsible to those stakeholders. And one of the things that was included in there was a requirement of a fishing mitigation plan. Can I get the next slide, please? All proposers were required to submit fisheries and environmental mitigation plans. The details and contents of those mitigation plans were dictated in the solicitation, and they were actually vetted through the F-TWG for feedback. So the feedback that was provided by the F-TWG as to what we should require in those mitigation plans were all discussed with the Fishing Technical Working Group and incorporated in the solicitation itself. So developers had to provide those. And in addition, the selected developers were required to work with the Fishing and the Environmental Technical Working Groups to evolve those mitigation plans. This provides an opportunity for the F-TWG and all of its members to engage with the selected developer on an ongoing basis through project development. So it gives you direct access to the F-TWG, direct access to the fishing, to the selected developers. If you're not part of the F-TWG and you would like to have input on those projects, I would encourage you to reach out to the representatives on the F-TWG that you're comfortable with and engage with them and use them as your representative in those discussions. But again, we're going to be working with the selected developers and the F-TWGs to evolve those mitigation plans over the course of the project. Additionally, the solicitations required consultations with state agencies and required that environmental data collected on the sites be made publicly available as soon as possible after qualifying the data itself. So I just want to take a moment now, though, to mention that while these are the requirements of the state's contract with the selected developers, these aren't the only things that developers need to do in terms of interacting with the fishing community. So this is just the way that the state felt that we could be reactive to the requests of our stakeholders, the way that we could stay engaged in the project, and the way that we could assure our stakeholders would have continuous access to those developers. But in addition to this, the developers are going to have to work through what is primarily a federal process and work with the federal agencies and stakeholders in a number of different ways in order to satisfy what they need to do through the construction and operation plans and secure their permits. So again, this is the state's approach to assuring engagement, but there are additional layers that the developers are going to have to work through in order to accomplish the individual projects. Next slide, please. So in that solicitation, or in that procurement, we identified 2 projects totaling 1,696 megawatts, so almost 2,000 megawatts of energy. This is the largest renewable energy procurement ever in the United States, and is a major step in New York State achieving its mandate of 9 gigawatts. And again, this initial procurement, this first procurement, is enough to power over 1 million homes for New Yorkers. Next slide, please. And I don't want to steal the thunder of Empire, but as a package, these 2 projects represent manufacturing and assembly in the capital region of New York State, so working up the Hudson Valley. It includes staging and installation work around the New York Harbor for the downstate region, and it includes long-term jobs out of operations and maintenance hubs from Brooklyn and Port Jefferson. So as a package, they provided really good geographic distribution and a wide degree of jobs and opportunities for New York State. And that equates to economic development opportunities. There were two projects selected. One of them was Empire Wind at 816 megawatts, and the other was at Sunrise Wind at 880 megawatts. We had a webinar the last hour with the Sunrise Wind team. That webinar and this one will be made available via the F-TWG website. So if you want to go back and reference it or point other folks to it, you're welcome to do that. But we'll be capturing these and recording these webinars and posting them on the F-TWG website. Get the next slide, please. So I just want to mention that we are in the process now of holding a series of public open houses. We're going to be meeting with stakeholders at an open house in Brookhaven on Tuesday, the 17th. We'll be out in Southampton on the 18th, Long Beach on the 19th. We'll be meeting in the Rockaways on the 23rd and at Sunset Park on the 25th. If you want more information about this, you can just go to the NYSERDA Offshore Wind page and get the details. But this is going to be an opportunity to meet with NYSERDA as well as with the selected developers and have one-on-one discussions with each of them. If you have any questions throughout this webinar that you'd like asked at the end, please feel free to use the chat function and submit those questions, and we'll be asking them of the developer at the end of the presentation. But now I'd like to turn it over to Martin Goff, the head of permitting for Equinor, to give a few details about the Empire Wind project. Martin?
Yeah, well, thank you for that overview and introduction, Greg. We at Empire Wind look forward to the continued collaboration with NYSERDA and the New York State agencies, and we'd like to welcome everyone that's joining this webinar today. So I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Martin Goff, and I'm the head of environment and permitting for Equinor Wind US, where one of my responsibilities and projects is the Empire Wind project, which is what I'm here to talk about today. And in my role, I'm tasked with developing these projects as responsibly as possible through avoiding and minimizing the impacts to the environment and existing in uses. And I'm supported in this role by my great development team and those dedicated to working with fisheries on, towards that goal on the team as well. And so a brief overview of the Equinor setup before I get into the Empire Wind project for those of you who are not familiar with us by now. Equinor is an international energy company with a long history of a presence here in the US, but we've been predominantly focused as an oil and gas and exploration and development company. But we've been transitioning towards a low carbon energy business over the last decade. And one of those ways to achieve that is by generating green electricity by offshore wind. I suppose the question is, why offshore wind? And well, our strengths are really working in the offshore marine environment more often than not in some challenging and harsh environments. And we know how to build and develop infrastructure in these marine environments, and we know how to do it safely and responsibly. And so for us, offshore wind is really the ideal area to transfer these skills. And Empire Wind won't be our first offshore wind farm. So we currently have 3 offshore wind farms in the UK, which we have constructed and now operate. And that's really our core part of our business. We like to continue to operate these, plus many more other opportunities, develop more wind projects around the world and here in the US. Next slide, please. But I now focus entirely on the Empire Wind project, which Greg covered briefly. And for those of you who are not aware, the Empire Wind project is located within Equinor's New York Bight lease area, as shown here on the map. And this lease area is approximately 14 miles from the closest point to the Long Island shoreline and about 20 miles from the closest point to the New Jersey shoreline. And as Greg mentioned also, the Empire Wind project was awarded a contract for 816 megawatts of electrical capacity, which roughly equates to power for around about 500,000 New York homes. And you can see in the map here, the red shaded area is the Empire Wind project site within that wider lease area. So it does not take up the whole lease, but we do know that it will be located on the western portion of that lease. And the Empire Wind project will be connected to the electrical grid at the Guana substation in Brooklyn via a buried export cable, as shown here as the orange line on this map, with an offshore electrical substation located within the offshore wind farm area itself, and an onshore electrical substation in the Brooklyn area close to the existing Guana grid. And the intention for the Empire Wind projects are for construction to begin sometime around 2022, with first power generation around the 2024 mark. Next slide, please. And so some of the key components of an offshore wind farm are shown here in this figure. And I'm going to go from left to right, from the offshore area to the onshore area, to try and describe each one of those components and how that will be made up as part of the Empire Wind project. And so starting offshore, the lease area in itself is in water depths of around 65 to 100 feet, with the shallowest area being in the western portion, getting deeper as you go further east. This makes all foundation types a real possibility for us, but for Empire Wind, the foundations that we've selected will be the gravity-based structures, which we refer to as GBS, and which I'll cover in a bit more detail in a moment. So the GBS will be the primary foundations, and they will sit on the seabed to support the wind turbines. And to date, we've based our wind farm design on wind turbines that are currently available on the market or off the shelf. But we aren't currently committed to any particular brand or size at this time. And so we're available to select the best available next generation technology at the right time. And so this affords us some flexibility as the project develops. But on the basis of existing wind turbines on the market, for example, a 12 megawatt turbine, this 1816 megawatt wind park would equate to around 68 turbines with one offshore substation. And noting that the next generation turbines are getting larger, and so they would effectively require fewer turbines and the associated foundations. You then have the inter-array cables, which are depicted in this figure as the orange lines, which transfer the electricity from the turbines to the offshore substation. And we're committed to burying those inter-array cables to depths that allow for continued use of the existing areas. So we have a requirement to bury to at least 4 feet, but we'll exceed that in areas where data and feedback suggests that's needed, in particularly to coexist with the fishing industry. There'll be one substation, which is depicted there, and we don't have any plans to have that to be continuously manned or to have accommodation on it. But as we'll show in the layout principles, the substation will be positioned in a manner that is consistent with the other turbines to maximize opportunities for continued access to that site. And then from the substation, you have the electrical export cables taking power from the wind farm to the onshore grid, which will likely be 2 cables in close proximity to each other. And as you'll probably recall from the previous slide with that orange line, it's not a direct straight line from A to B. And that's because we've taken great care to come up with a cable route that avoids or minimizes conflicts with other environmental and human uses to the greatest extent possible. And as with the inter-array cabling, we want to ensure that we can bury this cable. And indeed, part of the reason for that planned route is based on soil types that would facilitate this sort of burial. And appreciating that cables can become exposed in different circumstances, we'll be carrying out post-installation and periodical surveys to make sure that this cable remains buried at the appropriate depth. And so the whole wind farm area will be maintained by crews and vessels based in the New York area, with an operations and maintenance base in the New York area. Next slide, please. And so a little bit more about those GBS foundations, and to explain a bit more about them for those not too familiar. So essentially a GBS structure in this case is predominantly made up from reinforced concrete that sits on the seabed and remains stable on the seabed under its own weight. The wind turbine then sits on part of that, on top of that. They do not work everywhere in the world, as they do require certain ground conditions, but we're fortunate on the Empire Wind lease area that we have those favourable conditions. And these are not new technology. In fact, Equinor has been safely using gravity-based foundations in our oil and gas operations for decades now. And we've built up vast amounts of experience in manufacturing them, installing them, and the feasibility of where you can use them. And again, that's going back to drawing on our offshore oil and gas experience to benefit our offshore wind projects. And a great benefit of gravity-based foundations is that they can be made locally in New York, where there's existing experience in construction with reinforced concrete. We plan to source ours from the Port of Coymans near Albany. So also creating tremendous investment and jobs for the local area, and to serve as an industry that can serve to the rest of the offshore wind industry as it grows. And the grid GBS structures are not solid. They're in fact large chambers, large hollow chambers, and this is what allows them to be floated. And so with the ability to float, it means they can be transported to site using vessels, similar vessels and practices that are currently in use in this region, with all the great experience we have with tugs and barges. Then once on location, water is pumped into the GBS and they lower themselves to the seabed where they become very stable. And then for decommissioning at the end of the project life, it's basically a reverse process with the ballast water removed and the GBS refloated and removed. And as you can appreciate, there's a huge environmental benefit to the GBS in that they require no pile driving to install and no cutting to remove them at the end of the project life. Next slide, please. And as previously mentioned, we plan on the marine operations and maintenance base being located in New York, which will consist of an operations centre, a warehouse, workshop facilities and a dockside facilities. Along with that, it brings with it the good long-term well-paying jobs and the extended benefits to the supply chain that go with it. And that photo on the right is a fairly typical example of an offshore O&M base. This is from our own operated wind farm base in the UK. And the wind farm itself will be serviced most likely by a serviced operations vessel or an SOV, such as the one shown there on the left photo, which again is from one of our Equinor wind farms. And typically these SOVs remain in the wind farm for a period of about 2 weeks, coming in only to refuel, resupply, and for crew changes. Next slide, please. So in terms of the project timeline, so I did cover that very briefly in the opening slides, but you can appreciate that nothing really happens just overnight. And since Equinor signed the lease for the New York Bight area in 2017, there's been several years worth of site investigation, engagement and assessment so we can better understand the site and conduct the responsible sort of spatial planning and to prepare the permit applications for the wind farm. For example, the construction operations plan, which will be submitted this fall, which itself has several years of reviews, hearings and approvals before we get clear to start construction, which is shown here as from the 2022 sort of timeline to have a fully operational project from the 2024 to 25 mark onwards. Next slide, please. And so a big part of that schedule really relates to the work that we're doing now to ensure that we can plan this properly. And this includes all the work we've been doing to understand the site in terms of what we can build here. And as you can see from here, we've been extremely busy surveying the entire area, the entire lease area, to have as much data as possible for effective spatial planning. You can see the areas on the left covered by the geophysical surveys and on the right by the geotechnical surveys. And many of these surveyed areas where you can see the entire lease and multiple cable routes may never get used. The whole purpose of this is to give us a better understanding of what are the best areas to use, the less conflicting. And so there's really been a lot of effort and investment into understanding that. And as you'll know, this is not all of the Empire Wind area, but this approach also gives us a better understanding of the rest of the lease. It gives us the ability to understand where the first project should be positioned and where it should feed into, but it also gives us a better understanding for what the ongoing cumulative effects are likely to be as we go on to build out the rest of the lease as that eventually gets developed. Next slide, please. And a similar approach was taken for our environmental data, where we've built on existing surveys to carry out benthic sampling, both across the entire lease, which is shown there on the left, building on previous NOAA surveys, but also all of the export cable corridors, including that for the Empire Wind project in the figure there on the right. And again, some of these cable routes and this information will never be used, but it's all about giving us the best available data to make informed decisions. Next slide, please. And this wider area survey approach is consistent for most resources. For example, birds, marine mammals and fish shoals, where we've conducted monthly digital aerial surveys over the lease area, but also to complement the wider data that was collected by NYSERDA, not only over the lease, but over the wider New York Bight. And other data includes, for example, passive acoustic monitoring of large whale species, several years worth of wind, wave and oceanographic data from our Met Ocean buoys, and fish tag receivers supporting other research. And consistent with NYSERDA's requirements, we'll be making all of this data or non-proprietary data available either on our web page, on the web pages dedicated from the web pages dedicated to displaying the data and reports. Next page, please. So one of the key questions is, what do we do with all this information in terms of how that affects fisheries, and how are we approaching working with the fishing industry in Empire Wind? And from the outset, Equinor really does believe that when done responsibly, there is the potential for offshore wind developments and fishing to share the same space and to coexist. And so it's this aim for coexistence that we aim to achieve for Empire Wind by learning about the existing uses in the area by fisheries and avoiding and minimising impacts through mitigation. And this may be, for example, in the form of sensitive spatial planning, the way we communicate and share information, and some of the engineering practices put into place. But I also want it to be clear from the very start that Equinor has no intentions to restrict fishing within the operational wind farms. And we work with the fishing industry to establish processes that minimise conflicts during the construction phase, as we have tried to do during the development and survey phase as well. And so what do we actually mean by thoughtful spatial planning? And in this sense, it's about how we can design the wind farms and associated infrastructure to facilitate continued access for fishing. And so this will be in the form of wind farm layouts, which I'll expand on shortly, cables, so for our commitment to bury cables where feasible and to depths that are considering fisheries uses, and then what we use. So where cable burial is unavoidable, and we've heard feedback from the industry on some of the protection measures, we will, for example, avoid using concrete mattresses in fished areas. And a big part of doing this effectively is open and inclusive outreach. We've outlined our communications plan in the Equinor Wind Fisheries Liaison Plan, and then again in our Fisheries Mitigation Plan, that as part of this New York contract, which we'll be presenting to the Fisheries Working Group at some point very soon. And key to these outreach efforts are our dedicated staff. For example, we have Elizabeth Marchetti working on Equinor Wind, which includes the Empire Wind project, and she serves as fisheries manager. And we have Steve Drew and his support staff from Sea Risk as fisheries liaison officers. And both of them are working closely with myself and the project team. They're also in direct communication with the fishing industry, the reps, the organisations, and individual fishers, and covers both the commercial and recreational fishing communities. And we're also focused on how we do the outreach. Appreciating stakeholder fatigue is becoming a big issue. We'll be predominantly going through the FIRs, for example, through RODA, or for those not represented by RODA, we'll be going out to those particular reps. And we'll also be going out on our dockside visits, catching people at Fisheries Council meetings and open houses, and of course our commitment to the NYSERDA F-TWG, where we'll be presenting our plans. But there's also the efforts to keep fishers informed as much as possible of our activities associated with the development of the project. For example, we've been issuing mail shots and survey flyers to provide updates of our offshore survey activity and installed equipment. And we've used fishermen as offshore fisheries reps on board almost all of our survey vessels to communicate with fishers out in the field. And we're about to issue our layouts brochure, which details all the work we've been doing for spatial planning and layouts to really facilitate some of that feedback for the meetings for those layouts. And appreciating we're asking the fishing industry to trust us when we say we're going to do all of these things, we do hope that we've demonstrated in this development phase through the surveys our commitment to coexistence, mainly for our approach to avoiding fishing activity during the survey activities by a variety of means, such as real-time monitoring to adapt to survey areas, using scout vessels to identify and avoid fishing gear, and using the timing of surveys to avoid certain fishing areas. Next slide, please. And in terms of the data we've referred to, there are various sources all listed here, either provided by other sources, sourced direct from fishers, or collected by Equinor ourselves. And this is a short example of what we have, but we obviously value as much more data as we can get, and the more feedback we can get on this as possible, the better. And we really welcome that recently awarded NYSERDA study with RODA that will facilitate fisheries data collection. I think Greg referred to that as the Data Trust Portal. Next slide, please. So one of the key parts of spatial planning, as previously mentioned, relates to wind farm layouts. As amongst other things, having the ability to effectively fish safely in operation wind farm will be part of that, a great part of that coexistence. And so we started the layouts question by gathering as much information as we could over the past 2 years. And this has included direct verbal feedback on fishing methods, the areas fished, the timing, the frequency, certain areas that are used, and then listening to concerns over safety and access raised by the fishing industry. We've also been looking at historical fishing data from various sources, as well as our own monitoring, and requesting data directly from fishermen, such as plotter data and drawing on charts. And we'd be happy to go through all of those recommendations made to us, some of which are covered in the layouts brochure that we'll be issuing over the coming days or weeks. But essentially, they let us develop these layout principles that we are implementing voluntarily that should result in or facilitate layouts that facilitate continued sort of fishing access. The purpose really behind these are to give the fishing community some sort of foresight into what the layouts could look like, regardless of the final turbine positions and sizes, ultimately offering that flexibility to adapt the layouts to a certain point in the future based on the feedback in the regulatory process as that pans out over the next few years. And these layout rules outline things like the pattern and regularity, for example, turbines in generally straight lines, how we set out wind farm perimeters, marking and lighting, how we set out the rows, the orientation of rows. For example, feedback has predominantly been that rows should be in the direction of the dominant trawl direction, which is along the depth contour. So we've set all of those into the layout rules themselves. It also includes things on spacing, cable barrier and burial. And again, all of that is detailed in that layouts brochure. Next slide, please. And so this map demonstrates what an indicative layout looks like for the Empire Wind project, applying those rules, with the key factors for this one being that we have straight perimeters or boundaries to minimize the maritime navigation risk, both in the TSS lanes, but also for the mariner or fishermen approaching the wind farm or going into it. The turbines are in nice straight lines to avoid random structures, and this includes the substation, which I mentioned earlier, which would take the place of a turbine position. There's at least one line of orientation of rows to have that continued ability to have straight towing. And in this example, there's actually 3 orientations of rows. The dominant row alignment being in the direction of trawling along the depth contours, which is roughly in the southwest to the northeast direction, with subsequent rows in the north-south direction and also in the northwest to the southeast orientation. This particular example has a minimum spacing of 7/10 of a nautical mile, with varied spacing above this elsewhere in the wind farm. And again, that's something that we're open for consultation. And so what we're really looking for now is further feedback on these layout principles and the indicative layouts, so that we can establish a reasonable layouts that balance both our sort of responsible, commercially feasible wind development with the ongoing sort of opportunities for access to the area once it's operational, and all in the same time of supporting the future areas for offshore wind to meet the state's mandate for 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. And so those layout brochures will be sent out very soon, and we look forward to consulting with the fishing industry and gathering as much feedback as we can. Next slide, please. And so finally, for this session, I'd like to highlight some of the work that we're actually actively collaborating and participating in, or looking to collaborate in various activities and research So for example, we're committed to sign up with ROSA and support fisheries research there. We're supporting offshore training programs. We're participating on the F-TWG, the E-TWG, and the RODA task force. We're also supporting the recent NYSERDA funded study on fisheries access by providing personnel time to that, 1 day a week of our fisheries manager. And we're committed to having research funds for fisheries and for fisheries research and for coexistence practices, to either add that to existing studies or to go for standalone studies or opportunities. And as mentioned previously, we want to make all of the non-proprietary data we collect available to add transparency, but also to add value to other areas. Next slide, please. And so finally, I'd like to thank you all for your time this Friday afternoon, and I welcome more extended discussions with you all in the future. And as always, you can contact us for further details to provide feedback on any of the contacts listed here. But I am sort of now available for questions in this Q&A session. But I thank you for listening.
Martin, thank you very much. Greg, I'll turn over to you to see if you can pose some questions to Martin and Equinor about the project.
Thanks, Pat. The first question that came in, I think, is probably related to my presentation. So there's a question about our outreach meetings or our stakeholder meetings. So the open house, the format for the open houses that NYSERDA is conducting over the next couple of weeks with the Sunrise and Equinor team are designed to have formal presentations at the beginning. So a formal presentation from NYSERDA as well as from each of the developers. And then we follow that up with an opportunity for representatives from both of those developers as well as from NYSERDA to be on the floor answering questions one-on-one. It's a slight change from our previous format where we took questions up front. Given the nature of two different project areas and the NYSERDA role, we probably wouldn't have time to answer all the questions that were being asked. So we're trying this walking the floor and speaking with people one-on-one to try to answer questions that way. In relation to that, there was another question about whether we would be conducting these open house meetings in Rhode Island. And so we don't have plans to do open house meetings of this nature in Rhode Island at this time. We do, however, include Rhode Island on our F-TWG, and we do have regular interactions at the state level with representatives of the state government in Rhode Island. But I'll also turn that one over to Martin and ask, do you guys plan on having outreach meetings in Rhode Island? And can you speak a little bit about outreach meetings generally, regionally?
Yeah, we certainly do plan to have outreach meetings in Rhode Island, and we will be conducting meetings from New Jersey up to Maine and wherever we are needed to do that. And so we're fully inclusive of all of the fishing types and fishing organizations that we want to engage with. And so if you feel that you're being missed out in any of this, then please contact us. That is not our intention, and we would love to get in touch and have those discussions.
All right, we had a question about layout and layout rules and draft layouts. So to what degree is there consensus around what layouts should be, or are there very different recommendations coming out from the fishing community as about what folks would like to see in terms of layout? So I think it's relation to your project, but also what you've heard about other projects in the region.
Yeah, so I think the different areas have different requirements for different layouts, and we have another lease in the New England area where some of the requests there are different for different reasons. But focusing purely on the Empire Wind area, we've taken all of the feedback that we've got to date to use that to establish these existing layout rules, and we've been doing that for, with the best intentions to think that this is what the feedback we've been given. The intention now isn't that this is 100% fixed layout rules and this is where we're going. The intention is to really do a sense check on that through some of these consultations to make sure, number one, have we accurately interpreted the feedback we've been getting, and are these layout rules correct? And then number two, then if they are, are the layouts that we're presenting here, what is the feedback on those? And so it's really a two-step process, because we don't want to get too far down the line taking the wrong approach. We really want to understand whether we're going the right way or the wrong way now, so that we have the time to modify things and go the right way.
Thank you. And just adding to that, I mean, I think the study that we're supporting for fishing access will inform some of that as well. So I think people are seeing this as an important consideration, and it's getting worked on from a lot of different angles. So how is Empire Wind accommodating transit lanes? We've talked a little bit about in my presentation, and had conversation with fishing about transit lane in the New York Bight. And to some degree, we've been thinking about new lease areas, but how is Equinor thinking about the existing lease area and transit lanes?
Yeah, I mean, transit lanes are a very relevant topic, not just here, but quite most of the New York Bight area and up to New England. And we're very aware of what's going on in New England as well from our leases up there. But we have been engaged in the NYSERDA transit lane workshops, and that's been really useful to us, and great timing really, because we've been able to use a lot of that information as part of feeding that data into our own navigational safety risk assessment. But I think for where Empire Wind sits, we think that some of the work that's been going on in the transit lane workshop, and the work that BOEM and Coast Guard are doing to look at potential transit lanes, we think that that's the most appropriate way to do it, to look at areas before future lease areas are leased, so that if we're going to implement transit lanes, we can do it before that happens. And we think that some of the proposed routes predominantly to the east of the lease area will be effective for providing for that case.
Thank you. One of the questions that comes up oftentimes, you guys have an interesting image of a couple of tugboats pulling a gravity-based foundation. Can you give us an estimate of the approximate diameter that you would expect these things to be? So how big are these gravity-based foundations?
Yeah, it really does depend on the type of gravity base that you select. There are different manufacturers out there at the moment, which is good for competition. It's good for choice. We currently have an ongoing sort of process at the moment to get the preferred supplier and design. The foundations themselves are not much different to when you have monopiles with scour protection around them, the actual footprint. But what we will be doing is taking the worst case scenario when we go through the impact assessments as part of the COP process. So regardless of what the options will be and what we end up choosing, we will try and assess it on the worst case, so that we're representing what could be the worst thing to happen, rather than what will actually sort of happen.
So if I could press you a little bit harder, are we talking about 100 meters across or 50 meters across? Just some relative scale?
Yeah, we're talking about 50 meters across.
Thank you. And again, just reminding everyone on the webinar, if you have any questions, please use the chat function to submit them. We've got a few minutes left. So one of the things that we hear about oftentimes from fishermen is in response to navigation aids, and how site development will use navigation aids to support safe and efficient transit through the site. Can you speak a little bit about navigation aids planned for the Empire Wind project?
Yeah, so for us, I mean, we're open to obviously follow the best management practices and the guidance of both BOEM and Coast Guard, and whatever we're not only meant to supply as a minimum, but also to go above and beyond and put the navigation aids that will allow for continued access and continued safe passage through the wind farm, whether that's AIS transponders on every turbine or transponders. We'll look for what is being asked of us and what would be the most effective means for that. And so really a lot of it is about sharing that information up front, as well as having nav aids on there. So we will share the positions of all the wind turbines, both for inclusion on charts, but also on plotters. And our fisheries liaison officers are willing to go around with that information on charts and on USB sticks, or to download onto plotters, and in whatever means possible to give everyone an idea of where these are. And it's really, first of all, about sharing the information of where these assets are so that everyone's aware, but then we will be open to exploring all the navigational aids that really do facilitate that and keep it as safe as possible.
All right, and I have one more. So there's a question about snagging risks, and this is a conversation that comes up a lot with cable crossings and concrete mattresses. Can you talk a little bit about the approach that Equinor is thinking about when it comes to reducing snag risks?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the part of the process for the cable laying is to find the best sort of cable route that will facilitate sufficient burial. And so that's why you saw on that map with the geophysical and geotechnical data, it's like a bowl of spaghetti out there with the survey lines. And that's because we wanted to survey as much areas as possible so that we could select the best areas where we could actually achieve that burial. And the whole point of that sufficient burial is to avoid things like snagging risk in the future. Where we can't get sufficient burial in areas, for example, if there is a crossing of another asset that is not currently buried deep enough to facilitate that, then we will explore what surface protection measures are most appropriate to the uses around that area. And so we have discounted concrete mattresses. That's been feedback to us over the last 2 years that it's not a preferred protection measure. And so we've removed that from our design envelope, and so we'll be looking for other alternatives such as rock placement or gravel.
Great.
And then we follow that up with surveys. And so once it's installed, we go out and do a post-installation survey to ensure that the target burial depth that we wanted has been achieved. And if it hasn't been achieved, then what can we do to remedy that? And then we'll go out with periodical surveys in areas that may be at higher risk to ensure that, first of all, that those cables are maintain their burial. And if not, then we share that information with the fishing community and maritime community as soon as possible so that no accidents or snagging can happen while we go and remedy that.
Thank you very much. All right, with that, I think we're going to wrap up. We're out of questions. Again, if you're interested in having more conversations with the Empire team, the Sunrise team, or with NYSERDA, please check us out at the open house meetings coming up this week and next. We'd be happy to chat with you more there. Additionally, if you're looking for information about the Fishing Technical Working Group, you can access that information via NYSERDA's Offshore Wind page. And again, we post all the activities of that group as well as the work products of that group on the F-TWG webpage. But any last words, Martin, before we close out?
No, I just thank everyone for participating on a Friday afternoon.
And again, thank you. And again, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the F-TWG website, so you can go back to it or share with others. I'll turn it back over to Pat. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We appreciate it. Again, this will be recorded and posted, as Greg said, on the F-TWG website. And everyone have a terrific weekend. And thank you very much. Good night.